word Seminole is not a native word at all. It comes from a Spanish word, cimarron. And that way of saying it with the R, cimarron, is not how native people speak. In most of the dialects and languages of the native tribes, there's no R's. So without that R, cimarron becomes Seminole or Seminole. And so that was the early ways of saying that. The Spanish began calling these groups of Florida native people that word. Over time, it just got changed by the time the Americans took over Florida in 1821 to Seminoles. Okay? And they referred to all of them as Seminoles, but they weren't one group. They were many groups of peoples. Many different languages were spoken. Even African languages were spoken in the Seminole communities and towns. And so by 1710, in that era, an Englishman up in the Carolinas brings in a raiding party into Spanish territories. And that time that includes parts of Georgia and over to Pensacola, and all these missions have been built. The missions were basically money makers for the Spanish and helped feed St. Augustine and support St. Augustine, the main spot. So the missions were attacked by Moore and other native tribes up that way in the North Carolina, South Carolina region, Georgia area. They started giving them guns and encouraging them to come down and fight these Catholic natives. Okay? And so they did so because these were old enemies anyways, and now they've got guns. The Spanish were very afraid to give guns out to the natives because early on in the 1500s, they had revolts, and they were afraid if they gave too many guns out, these revolts would be very devastating. So they didn't give out guns to the mission natives. But the English, willing to give out guns, encouraging these tribes to come down and raid these missions. Starting in 1710, the Moor raids is what wiped out all the Spanish missions in Georgia and the north part of Florida. And when this happens, most of those original tribes that we saw that map earlier were almost gone by that time anyways. And the leftovers were what's on these missions. Some of these people are going to join up with people in St. Augustine. And when the Spanish turn Florida over to the British period, they're going to leave with the Spanish to the islands in Cuba. And today people are finding DNA of people down there in Cuba with matching the people of Florida from long ago. And so that's not part of that story where they left Florida with the Spanish. Some of them did. But not all of them. Some of them stuck around. Some of them were still living in small groups, and they were joining other groups. Slaves also started coming into Florida. Even early on, the Spanish did have slavery, but later they didn't have slavery at all. As a matter of fact, they encouraged slaves to migrate their way down to Florida for freedom. The first freed African settlement in North America is St. Augustine at Fort Mose. It's today a state park, and it's right outside of the main part of town, but that was their community. And as long as they became Catholics and took up arms against the English, which they were very glad to do, they could live there free. And so the first way of freedom for slaves was down to Florida, and they did. And they lived there for quite a while. When the Spanish turned Florida over to that British period, those slaves had to leave. Instead of going back to slavery times, they went into the wilderness, and they joined up with the natives. They formed their own towns. One of them was called Angora, which was near Tampa, and that was a black community of runaway slaves. And we're finding these places in other areas of Florida as well. So in this migration down into Florida of different peoples, of slaves, of the old natives that are still here, and now we're going to talk about one more group, and that would be my family's groups, the Creeks. We're called Creeks by English, but we were actually about 40 little tribes in Georgia and Alabama. English called us the Creeks. Our main language was Muskogee, with the language I spoke to you earlier. And the English calling us Creeks, during the American takeover of the Georgia lands, which was through treaties, deerskins was money. The natives knew that they brought deerskins in as trade, they could get what they wanted, like the cloth I'm wearing. and like the metal knife in my belt, or the shiny silvers that we love to wear so much, and the glass beads. These were all trade goods. The guns, all these things we had to get through trade, and through 100 years during the 18th century, Native Americans did lots of trading. They went from living in Stone Age time, using clay pots, to using metal pots, from using arrowheads and spears and bows and arrows to using the muskets and the rifles. And so they went through that period of trade where the deerskin was the money. The deerskins were shipped out of Charleston and other ports by the thousands until they reached their destination, Europe, which they were very, very valuable. For the native, the biggest deer was worth more. And so that was a buck. The buck deer, the boy deer. And today we call money in America buck, because back then it really was a buck. And that's a little side note there for you. So that's how we could get these items. And so within just a few generations, this is during the British period, this was a drawing done by a famous naturalist who traveled right here to New Smyrna. His name was Bartram. That's right, I was right. William Bartram. And he did this drawing of the Long Warrior, Miko Talapo, and that was his rendition of what he looked like. Of course, you see a lot of European features there because of the art that he probably did. This was actually the only human, from my knowledge, that he ever did. He always did plants and animals because he was a naturalist and he was studying the plants and animals. But Long Warrior became his friend, and another chief above this one was called Ahaya. You might know him as the cow keeper. Okay? His village came down into Florida in about 1750 from Georgia. They were mid-Georgia village called the Oconee. And they went from living there down to where Gainesville, Georgia is. So they went from being a bulldog to a gator. Actually, they did move down here, and it was still Spanish Florida. And that was the enemies of the Creeks. Okay? The Creeks didn't like the Spanish. As a matter of fact, they kicked out one of their tribes called the Yamasees in 1708 and 1710. In that era, the Yamasees had a war with Charleston and the English because they felt like their trade was being cheated. And so they had a war. The other tribes felt like, hey, you guys are going to ruin it for us. And so everybody joined up and they drove them out. And to St. Augustine they went and became the allies to the Spanish, just like the runaway slaves. Now these guys here came down here during that Spanish period, and not long after that it will turn British, and good for them because they got along good with the British. Matter of fact, these tribes, the first ones to be known as Seminoles, are these guys right here, the Oconees, but there were some coming in earlier than them into Florida. Groups of Miccosukee speakers, okay? Miccosukee, a tribe today in Florida, another federal tribe besides the Seminole, the Miccosukee. And one of those groups is going to have their communities right here in this area, okay? The leader of that group is called Imathla. His white man name is King Philip. Now, with that kind of a name, it tells me he might have had some connections with the Spanish probably early on. His son is going to grow up to become a wildcat, okay? And Wildcat is the one that's going to burn all the sugar mills here in this area. We'll talk about him later. We're going to see his picture later. But during this period is when these people start coming out of Georgia, these languages. They're tired of all the crowding up there with the English. The English are now, deerskins aren't valuable in the late 18th century as much as they were in the early 18th century, but land is. And if we've traded you all of our deer away, and now our land has no more deer, it's no longer valuable to us. We're going to give it to you pretty cheap because it's no longer valuable to us. And so they start trading little bits of land away, and that's how the tribes eventually lose Georgia. So you start seeing these Georgia tribes start moving out of there, and they start coming down here to this empty Florida where the old tribes lived, and or lived. And they start occupying these old sites. And one of them is called Tuscaloosa, which is where William Bartram meets the Long Warrior and the Cow Keeper, the chief above him. Now, Cow Keeper is going to make a journey here to New Smyrna. It's even in the Turnbull book. You can read about it. where he doesn't realize that these are allies of the English because of their language barrier. They don't speak much English in the New Smyrna colony in the early days. A lot of Greek and a lot of other languages. And so he thinks they're Spanish. And because the Spanish are his enemies, he's going to come take care of business on his own. Luckily, Turnbull gets here in time and heads him off and says, no, these aren't Spanish. And after giving him a little to drink, I believe, he finally eased up. And I think a few people got beat up in that little confrontation. There's a story about it. You can read about that. Anyways, so that's the Long Warrior. And the Cow Keeper, there's no painting of him. Ahia is his name. And they're the two earliest Seminole chiefs that we recognize, kind of. They're the first. They're going to bring in other tribes of Georgia once the English take over Florida. And they're going to make a pact, and they're going to sign treaties at a big fort on the St. Johns River called Fort Picolata. Today that's where Palatka crosses, kind of in that area, a little north of that. So that area right there is a big fort, and the treaties will be signed with the Seminoles and the British, the first treaties the Seminoles will ever sign with a white man as a tribe. Okay? So they're not officially a tribe before that, because the word Cimarron is just a name the Spanish call them, meaning wild, renegades, runaways, free. So those are a lot of definition of that word. And eventually it just becomes known as the Seminoles. Let's move on.